What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect. In this video, I'm going to be showing how I created this fake UFO shot inside of Blender using some basic 3D modeling and compositing techniques. As usual, this scene breakdown is not only a tutorial, but hopefully will provide some insights on how you can create some similar effects on your own. This video should be pretty straightforward. However, there are a few concepts that you may not use regularly in your own videos, including exporting a mist path and adding it over your entire live action environment in order to procedurally add mist to your shots. And also I'm going to show a technique that I use to add 2D atmospheres to live action shots using some assets from our atmospheric add-on as well. Anyways guys, without further ado, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. This is our scene setup here. Now, before we actually added our ship to our shot, go ahead and show you guys the live action shot that I chose to add this UFO to. So you can see kind of a basic shot pointing out of the plane window here. And you might notice that compared to the final result here, I also added a little bit of camera shake to that final result. Now, obviously you didn't have to do that, but I just found it gave it a little bit more of a gritty feel. So that's one thing that I did there. But anyways, I've imported this video inside of Blender, inside of the motion tracking tab here. And this is generally the first step you're going to take when compositing 3D CG into a live action. So I've gone ahead and tracked a few points here over the course of our timeline like so. And I do have a tutorial on how you can 3D camera track inside of Blender very easily. So I'll put a link to that in the description below. It's one of our most watched videos, but that video, if you're not familiar with camera tracking, will help you integrate 3D CGI into live action by helping you recreate that camera move inside of the computer, as I've mentioned many times before on this channel. So the first thing I did was import and track our footage here. You can see our solve error is 0.38 pixels, which is pretty decent for adding that UFO to our shot. So then I've solved that camera and I've imported that camera into our 3D scene here, which as you can see, if I select it and I play through our scene, our camera is moving in the same way as our live action camera was moving as it filmed the shot. And you can see some of the tracking data that I've lined up our ground plane here too for realistic reflections, but we'll get to that in a minute. Next, I added our main CG UFO element into our scene. So at first I just used a very basic sphere and added it to our scene. Then I cut it in half with a Boolean modifier and then animated one half of the sphere moving up over the course of our timeline. As you can see here, I wanted to just create a little bit of dynamic movement on our 3D model there to give it a little bit more life. So pretty basic keyframes. I animated this half sphere over the course of our timeline like so, with the keyframes down here. And then I've also just added a very basic concrete material to these spaceship elements as well. So you can see in the shading tab, pretty basic little material here. I just used this concrete plates texture, which I'll find here. Just use this guy on the bottom left to add a little bit of detail to our UFO element here. I'll go ahead and just go into rendered view to show you guys what it looks like. I've also added a sky HDRI environment to our scene to just give it some environmental lighting. But this is how our material looks for our ship. And the reason you're getting some specular highlights here is because I've just used the diffuse texture here as our roughness input as well, after adding a color ramp input into it and boosting the contrast up a little bit. So that's going to give it some specular highlights and some reflective areas on the whiter areas of our diffuse texture here. I've also used the same concrete plates diffuse texture and run it through a bump node to create a little bit more realism and variation in our surface here. So pretty basic material setup here, probably as basic as you can get it. And you can see if I add a sun to our scene and I just kind of make it go sideways here, I'll rotate it sideways here, then give it a value of 10. You can see the specular highlights, and that really helps to give it a little bit of realism to our ship here. Now I could just use these perfect half sphere elements as our UFO in our scene, but I wanted to add some greeble detail in the modeling of these half spheres here. So I just wanted to add some small scale detail on these elements to just give it a little bit more of an interesting look. And I wanted to do this without using any manual modeling techniques. So I decided to use a greeble displacement map on our two half spheres here. And I actually made a full tutorial on how you can use these greeble displacement maps to add that extra detail to your 3D models without having to go in and model everything yourself. So go ahead and show you guys the result after we add these greeble displacement maps. But essentially what we do here is you take a texture, and I'll show you in the UV editing tab here. This is our greeble displacement map. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to use it to define what parts of our 3D mesh are extruded compared to others. You can see here the white parts will be extruded more, and then the dark parts will be extruded less. And I'll show you guys once we apply this modifier what it's going to do. So what I've done here to use that displacement map texture that I've just shown you, it's called a greeble displacement displacement map texture is I've just gone into the modifiers tab and I've added a few things here to make everything work. First, I've added a subdivision surface modifier, and that's going to give us more vertices to work with in order to use the displacement map effectively. And then I've also added a displacement map modifier with the greeble texture on it. And you can see if we go to the texture tab that we're using this texture in this displacement modifier. So if I turn these last two on, there's our subdivision surface, which is going to add more vertices to work with. And then we're going to add the displacement modifier. Now you can see what that greeble height map texture is doing to our very simple 3D model. And it's just adding that small scale detail, which is going to provide a lot more interest to the eye. And you can obviously adjust the strength of this displacement map as well. So for example, you want it to be more subtle, you can do 0.01 instead of 0.1. And now you're just gonna have really subtle displacement on this element here. So you can see if I go into rendered view, what it looks like, it's gonna really carve up the mesh in a way that's a lot more interesting than just the basic, perfect half sphere here. So just a little technique that I use to add a little bit more detail to our scene. I'll go ahead and bring our strength back up to 0.1 to show you guys what our final result would look like. You can see it's just using that height map data through that image texture to drive what parts are extruded and what parts are staying back. So I've just done that to both of our half spheres here. See if I turn both of them on here, what that's going to look like. And using these greeble displacement maps is a great way to add just a lot more detail very quickly inside of Blender. So this was going to be our final ship here. Very simple to do. Again, I'll put a tutorial to that in the description below if you want to get into the specifics of it, but you can see it's just going to carve up our mesh very nicely here. The next thing that I did was match the CG lighting to that of the live action shot. I talk about this all the time, and this is one of the most important steps when combining CG with live action, is just matching the four properties of light to that of the live action shot. And that includes the quality, quantity, color, and direction of the light source in the scene. So as you can see here for our live action shot, it's a really cloudy day with a fairly blue tone. So we don't actually need the sun here. I just added that just now for the sake of this tutorial to show off the detail. But if we just add our very basic HDRI with a similar image, that should provide us nice lighting to help integrate our element into the environment a bit better. So I've just used a very basic cloudy HDRI here to light our CG element and just brought down the strength to 0.5 until I felt it matched our environment. Now, obviously, if your CG elements are very reflective, you'll need to recreate the entire live action environment inside of the computer so you have realistic reflections, and that doesn't give away that your shot is fake. But I found that this very basic HDRI here, I'll just show it by itself here in a second. It's just a very cloudy city environment. You can see I found that this was enough to give us the detail and the ambient lighting that we needed for our final shot. So I've done that here, and that provides some pretty good lighting on our UFO spaceship. And I also added a very basic ground plane that acts as a holdout for this specific layer. But this ground plane doesn't actually show up in the render, but it does reflect the general color of our ground here. So I've just used the color picker tool to select, part of the live action ground here, and that general color is going to reflect back onto our CG environment, which is going to give much better lighting for our shot. Rather than, taking this away, all of a sudden the light levels on the bottom of our UFO spaceship are coming from that HDRI and are actually brighter than they should be. So by adding this ground plane, and I'll go ahead and show it here. Right now it's not showing up in the render, but it's just lighting our environment. Go ahead and turn off shadow catcher and this guy. You can see that this is actually what's below our spaceship, and I've just enabled it as a shadow catcher and a holdout in the view layer settings so that it wouldn't actually show up in our CG render, but it would block the lighting from the HDRI environment from below hitting our UFO spaceship. So that's going to help provide a lot more realistic lighting on our UFO element. The next thing that I wanted to do to have a little bit more life to the scene was add some particles kind of breaking off the ship as it's animated up into the sky here. So you can see if I just select our ship and I'll enable this particle system that I've added to my scene, and you can see I've just added a very basic particle system that drops some debris over the course of our timeline, and this torus is emitting these particles and is parented to the top portion of our UFO ship here. And by emitting these particles, we're almost creating the effect as if the two pieces of the ship are breaking apart from each other. So I just have a very basic particle system on this torus, and you can see if I go here, 2000 particles, frames start at 1, ending at 228 with a lifetime of 80. And yeah, they're just emitting over the course of that time period. And I'm actually instancing an orb debris collection on these particles so that it looks a lot more detailed. So if we pause here, you can see what this is doing. And if we go into rendered mode, this is what it looks like. Obviously the torus won't show up in the final render, but the particles will. So you can see if I just turn off show emitter for the time being, we get these kind of particles that are creating the effect as if the ship is breaking in half. So pretty cool little effect here, basic particle system. I've turned the gravity on, but I've turned the velocity on our particles off so that the only thing affecting them is the gravity itself. So now they're just falling as if they're breaking apart from our ship here. So super basic particle system there. So the next thing that I did was create a shadow catcher for our ship. So that's in our second view layer here. As you can see, I have 5 of them. Our first contains our ship render. The second is our shadow pass. So you can see here, I have our ground plane and I've enabled it as a shadow catcher, and I've enabled our foreground containing our UFO ship as an indirect only option on this view layer. And by doing that, now we have, you can see here, our subtle shadow that we can now use to composite on top of our live action shot separately. So that was our second view layer here. The next view layer that I've created is called Environment for Mist. And what I wanted to do for this specific shot is I wanted to add some procedural mist on top of our entire live action shot, as well as our CG ship. So what I've done is I've just turned on our spaceship as well as our background ground view layer. And I've duplicated our ground on a new collection called Ground for Mist Pass. And I've enabled to view it on this view layer. So now we have all this data to work with, and by exporting a mist pass of this data on this view layer, so you can see here, if I go to our view layer settings, you can see that I've selected the mist pass option rather than the combined beauty pass option. But by exporting this data in our compositor, we can then use this mist data to overlay on top of our final composite and simulate the effects that mist would have on a real environment. So just by recreating that general geometry of our live action shot, and then of course including our CG element within it, we can now overlay those 3D volumetrics and that mist onto our footage and create a really interesting looking result. So that's why I've created this view layer here. Next, I wanted to add some real atmospheric elements into our scene to help blend in the real live action clouds with some CG clouds in the environment. So you can see here, if I go to cloud atmospheres, you can see that I have a variety of planes here, and these planes all contain some mist elements from our atmospheric add-on that we released several months ago. But you can see we have a variety of different elements to choose from, and I think I've been using the lingering fog elements for this specific example. But you can see we have, upward steam loops if you want to use them as like chimney steam or something, and heavy steam plumes. You have a variety of different elements to choose from, and you just import these into your scene, and now you can composite the real element within the live action shot. So you can see these guys are looped and ready to go. If we go into rendered view, this is what we're getting, and you can see we're just rendering out these 2D planes, and our spaceship, you can see here in the middle, is enabled as a holdout, as you can see in the top right here, and it's actually going to create a 3D effect. Even though these elements are 2D, the layering of them creates a 3D effect that is pretty interesting and helps integrate that CG element into the live action shot a bit better. So I've just added a variety of these 2D atmospheres into the scene, and you can see them all right here. We select them, they're just 2D planes, and we're rendering these out on their own separate view layer so that we can composite them on top of everything with a lot more control and even increase the density of them in some cases. So pretty basic effect there. You can see that that's going to help integrate our UFO into the shot a bit better. And also by combining live action atmospheres with a CG mist pass, we can help bridge the scene between CG and live action even more. So that's what we've done here. Finally, the last view layer that we have created, I've called atmospheres on plane. So what I wanted to do is just create a very subtle kind of atmosphere effect on the plane wing here in our shot. So you can see I've just recreated the geometry of our live action plane inside of the computer. So this guy right here, I've just modeled out the basic geometry of that wing, and then I've added a particle system to the wing and just had it emit over the course of our timeline. And then I've instanced a volumetric icosphere on this plane. So you can see if I go into rendered view, we're getting all these kind of volumetric spheres coming off of the plane here. And in the compositor, I've added some motion blur to these elements to simulate how this kind of condensation or volumetric effect is coming off of our wing here. And I just wanted to give a little bit more speed to the shot as well. It was pretty subtle in the final result, but I just wanted to experiment with it to see what kind of effect I could create. I also added a turbulence field here to make the particles move in a little bit different way, but pretty basic little effect there. I have 15,000 particles over the course of our timeline emitted here, and I've just changed the velocity on the z-axis so that they would go in the right direction that I wanted them to. But pretty basic little effect there. I've rendered all of these effects on their own separate view layers, of course, holding out different elements on specific ones in order to just isolate them by themselves. And then in the compositor is where the real magic happened. As you can see here, this was our final result. Fairly basic node setup here. So I'll go ahead and go through these elements that we've added and combined together in our scene one by one here. So the first thing that we've used in our compositing node tree is our live action shot. So you can see if I just add an output node, we can take a look at what this looks like by itself. So here's our live action shot on frame 180. Then first thing we did was add our background shadow, which is pretty subtle here. You can see it if I just enable it by itself. Well, it's pretty hard to see, but there's a shadow there. And then we've overlaid that using an alpha over node on top of our footage. So you can see it just makes our ground a bit darker. The next element that I've added is our actual UFO element here. And I've actually rendered out an ambient occlusion pass with this UFO element as well. And I've combined that using a multiply node to deepen the shadows of the crevices on our spaceship. But you can see after our UFO element is added into the scene, and actually go ahead and go through the different color correction nodes that I've used on our UFO element as well, just to show you guys what we're doing here. Bring this back. So we have our combined beauty pass right here, like so. So we're taking this data with an alpha channel, and then I've combined this with a ambient occlusion pass that will deepen our shadows a bit there. Then I've actually overlaid the general color of our live action shot on top of our footage. Now, right now, this mix node is going to add that color over our entire image, but later you can see that we use a set alpha node, and then we can actually make it so that that color is only overlaid on our ship element. And by lifting the shadows of our ship element, it's going to look like it's more off in the distance, as I've covered many times before. So it's going to match your black levels a bit more. So I've added a little bit of RGB curves here to dial in the levels a bit. Then I've also added a little bit of blur to our ship to make sure it matched our live action footage. I've just added some blur on the X and Y axis here. And then finally, I've added a color balance node to make it a little bit warmer, as you can see there, before overlaying it on top of our live action shot. It's not matching the final composite right now because we haven't added the mist on top of our live action shot as well, but once we do that, it'll match a lot better. So the next thing that we did was add our cloud atmosphere elements on top of our entire composite. So you can see here, go ahead and show you guys right here. These are our cloud atmospheres, and you can see that we've used our ship as a holdout here. So it's integrated in 3D space, and we've just overlaid these cloud elements with a little bit of blur. So I've used a blur node to integrate it into the shot a bit better. And then finally, I've added a color balance node to warm it up a bit, and we've added it just like that. So now already we're helping to integrate that ship into our shot a bit better by adding those atmospheres. Our CG clouds and live action clouds are going to help integrate everything together when used in this way. So finally, the next view layer that we've composited onto our shot here is our mist pass. So you can see here, we have our environment for mist, and I've just taken that mist pass data. I've blurred it a little bit with this blur node. I've warmed it up a bit, just like we've done with everything else. And then I've actually overlaid it on two separate areas using two different screen nodes. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm actually overlaying it first on our live action shot by itself. So you can see here, if we do this, it's just overlaying that mist on top of our live action shot. So I'm using this data to overlay our mist. Now, you can see that I've just taken some masking elements here and I've blurred them. And by doing this, I can overlay this mist and then the mist on our live action element here separately and control them on their own. Essentially what I'm doing here is I'm taking the mist pass into this screen node on the bottom input, I'm overlaying it on top of our final composite, and then I'm taking this mask right here, and I'm saying with this node, apply the mist on these white areas, but not the ship here or the background here. And the reason I'm making this feathered with our blur node is because there's actually a plane in our CG environment where that mist stops. So we want to just kind of feather that in a bit. So you can see if I take this blur away, we get this. But by adding in this blur with this specific matte data, it helps to make that a lot more integrated. And finally, with this screen node, I'm saying apply the mist pass only to our CG ship here. So when we do that, we get the ship with the mist pass as well. So you can see with just the environment mist pass, and then finally with the second node, we apply the mist on top of our UFO as well. So that might seem a little bit complicated, but essentially we're just using two mattes to tell Blender composite the mist pass in the environment in this way and composite the mist pass on the ship in this other way. So we're just selectively compositing our mist with a little bit more control using matte data. So finally, after adding our mist pass, I've added our atmospheres on the plane. So I wanted to add the subtle vapor coming off of the wings here. So I've taken that data, I've desaturated it a bit, added a lot of blur on the X and Y axis, and also some directional blur that goes side to side to help blend everything together. So I can show you guys that pass by itself here. Here's our wing vapor. Then I've added, some blur elements here to create this effect. And it's going to be pretty subtle here. I've actually kept it pretty subtle, but of course you can dial it up a bit. But then I've, added some color correction here. So it was a little bit warmer, and then overlaid it actually 2 times on top of our footage since I wanted it to be a little bit more intense than it was coming out to be at first. So you can see before and after. Here's before and after. You can see it coming off the wing there. Now, pretty subtle effect. Obviously you could enhance it if you want, but that was the general idea. Finally, I added a color balance node to blend in our shot for the final composite to get this result. Anyways, guys, that is it for this breakdown. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to learn next on the channel, and I'll see you next time.